Hi, this is Dr. Burton. Welcome back. Today, we want to talk a little bit about courage. It's a theme that's been coming up a lot. I was reading around on the internet and I saw, I don't know, maybe it was a meme, but it said something like courage begets courage. And I thought, that's interesting. What does that mean? And then I was reading in some books. I'm in some discussion groups talking about different books, and the theme came up again there. And I thought, this is a good theme for public philosophy in a discussion. So today we want to talk about what is courage and in what context are we bringing it up. So we've been talking about doing public philosophy in the face of, a crisis in our culture, strange times, what this book I'm going to talk about calls the age of disruption. What is disruption and what does it require? So we are living through some difficult times. Rapid changes are coming, and sometimes it's hard to speak your mind. We've been talking about living in truth, live not by lies. That requires courage, right? So let me give you a little bit of context to bring you into the way I'm thinking about courage. Courage is a virtue. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to something else. And I was reading in this book, The Age of Disruption, with the philosophy club at my college. And it's a dark book. There's some dark stuff in here. And I'm going to read to you a couple quotes about the age of disruption that we're living through. This book was written in 2019. Some of it's a little bit earlier, 2015. And the author, Bernard Stiegler, he's very insightful. This book is probably considered postmodern. He's in the continental tradition of philosophy, building on Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard. Those were some of his teachers, but he has a fresh approach to this topic of disruption and technology, and he is saying that we all have this feeling in ourselves that we're moving towards something and like a new age or a new era or something completely radically different. We're almost on a precipice of sorts, and it's like a global explosion. And then he says, today, this explosion is imminent. This is 2019. All of us now know it and fear it, but also repress it and deny it. And we do so in order to continue living with dignity. This is, however, something that can no longer be repressed. In the stage we have now entered, this becomes precisely unworthy and literally cowardly. So we're facing a crisis, an explosion, a global social explosion, and to avoid the fact is cowardly. Okay, then he talks about the young people. He brings a quote from a magazine, French magazine, where a young man named Florian wrote to the magazine, and they quote it, and Stiegler quotes it. He says, and this is Florian, "You really take no account of what happens to us, the young people. When I talk to young people of my generation, those within 2 or 3 years of my own age, they all say the same thing. We no longer have the dream of starting a family, of having children or a trade or ideals, as you yourselves did when you were teenagers. All that is over and done with because we're sure that we will be the last generation or one of the last before the end." So that's Florian. He is the last generation. And I imagine some of my students are feeling that way too. This really struck me because Florian is 15 years old when he said that, and that's 2019. So this is the age of my students, and it makes me sad, okay? But it's a reality. And this is a kind of despair that Florian is expressing. Now, there's one more quote I want to read to you, and it's about optimism and pessimism and the need for courage. Optimism and pessimism tend to reinforce one another by enclosing themselves in denial. So both optimism and pessimism deny some reality, which, as we know, can lead to the unfurling of what psychoanalysis describes as rationalizations. That is, lies perfectly constructed so as to conceal reality. Pessimism and optimism both deny the obvious, namely the imperative to be neither pessimistic nor optimistic, but courageous. So those who are pessimistic, like some of the people commenting on my Gab videos, pessimism was there. And I saw people who claim to be Christian being very pessimistic when I asked who's coming to save us. Are we doomed? But optimism is like another kind of denial. It's denial of the reality of evil, right? Everything's going to be fine. No, everything's not fine, and it's not going to be fine, and that's why we need courage. Okay, we need courage. Another book I'm reading, happen to be reading another book that's talking about virtues and the place we're at today in society. It's After Virtue by Aleister Mcintyre. I read this book in 2006 when I was in grad school, and I probably didn't read it very carefully. I see there's notes in here, but I wasn't impressed at the time, and it's probably because I had a certain optimism back then. 2006, I'm in grad school. I wasn't married yet. Life was pretty good. And so this book was written in 1984, 35 years before The Age of Disruption was written. I started rereading it for a book discussion I'm in. My Benedict option friends were reading this book next. The other night I couldn't sleep, so I woke up at like 4 a.m. and started reading the book, and I was shocked. It was dark. It was dark. He begins with chapter 1 called A Disquieting Suggestion. Disquieting, you know it's going to be, okay, this is uncomfortable. He begins by telling this story. He says, imagine that the natural sciences suffer a major catastrophe. Maybe people become like anti-science. They burn all the science books. They wreck all of the labs, and people become, there's like a movement that's like, science is evil, and then they destroy all of the knowledge that we have built up in science. And then later there's a reaction to that. And there's a movement to restore science. But the problem is we've like wrecked all of the knowledge. We've ruined the past. So they have fragments left over of what science was. They have scientific words, but the fragments, they try to put these into practice, but it has no foundation. They've lost the basic beliefs of science that supported science in the past. And so what they rebuild is nothing like the original science. They use the same words, but now the words have different meaning, almost meaningless. And so the sciences they're a shadow of what they used to be. And people think they're doing science. Okay, so he says, imagine this scenario. Now, imagine instead of science, it's morality. And then he says that's actually what has happened. We've lost the knowledge of the basis for morality. We use words that seem to be moral, have moral implications, but we've lost the basic beliefs that support morality. And I was like, he's right. We have. And I teach ethics. So here's how I'm doing like a history of ethics unit. And you see what has happened in the history of philosophy. There's nothing to support morality after the modern period. And I think that Mcintyre is going to make the case that before the modern period, there was a basis in metaphysics for morality, and we need to get back to that. He's the guy that calls for a new Saint Benedict that the Benedict option is based upon. Basically, Western Civ is going into a very dark place, and we need a new Saint Benedict. So it's kind of like we need to go back to tradition, which I don't think is going to work. But another dark thing about his analysis that I never noticed before, which I completely agree with, is that analytic philosophy is not in a place to help identify the foundations of morality that have been lost. He says, we may notice that if in this imaginary world analytic philosophy were to flourish, it would never reveal the fact of this disorder. For the techniques of analytical philosophy are essentially descriptive, and descriptive of the language of the present at that. The analytic philosopher would be able to elucidate the conceptual structures of what was taken to be scientific thinking or moral thinking, and discourse in the imaginary world in precisely the way that he elucidates the conceptual structures of natural science as it is. So analytic philosophy could describe both real science or the rebuilt science in the imaginary world, but all it can do is describe. It can describe morality as we have talked about it in the past. We can describe morality as we talk about it now, but we don't understand the foundations for morality because analytic philosophy doesn't do normative ethics. It doesn't do metaphysics, which ethics rests upon. So I think that's true. And then he notices the continental philosophers aren't going to help us out of this either. And he names two fields of continental philosophy. He says, nor again would phenomenology or existentialism be able to discern anything wrong, either in the imaginary science world or in the moral world in which we live right now. All the structures of intentionality would be what they are now. The task of supplying an epistemological basis for these false simulacra of natural science would not differ in phenomenological terms from the task as it is presently envisaged. So describing the phenomenology of fake science, describing the phenomenology of real science would be the same thing as would fake morality and real morality. So these main ways of doing philosophy cannot get us out of the problem of a lost comprehension of both theoretical and practical morality. Okay, so he's going to say we need a different kind of philosophy to help us with the moral landscape we find ourselves in. I would add that Frankfurt School philosophy, critical theory philosophy can't help us either because it's essentially pragmatic, not theoretical, and is not going to help us with the philosophical foundation needed for doing morality. Okay, so why am I bringing this up? This book is called After Virtue. Virtue is a means to the good, so it's probably after the good as well. And what is the good? And what is virtue in relation to the good? So the good is knowing the end in itself. Aristotle says the good is the end in itself, what is sought for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. And the good is connected to ultimate reality. So knowledge of ultimate reality is what the good is. Now, if you are a skeptic, as the modern philosophers are, then you would say we can't know ultimate reality, so we can't know the good. And if virtue is a means to the good, like courage is needed in order to pursue knowledge of ultimate reality. We'll say knowledge of the truth about ultimate reality. Knowledge of God, if you want. Courage is needed for that. So a new philosophy that Mcintyre is suggesting is going to require courage. Okay, so what is courage? Let's talk about courage. I'm going to use one resource, but you know what? This is just an introduction. You can do some research yourself. After I bring it up, you can go dig around and find more. This is a book that I have, The Great Ideas by Mortimer Adler. These are the ideas that are worked out in the great books of the Western world. And there's an entry on courage. And I'm going to read a little bit from this. There's probably about 10 pages on courage, but I want to just give a little bit of context because it helps us to see different ways we need courage, different contexts for courage. Now, the first context, and this is historically first too, in the West, the first context that courage is hailed as a virtue is in heroism, the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is courage needed for action. So let's call that one category of courage. Courage needed for action. So let's read about what that is. The heroes have boundless passions, emotions, and fear is one of them. When they are called fearless, it is not because nothing affrights them or turns their blood cold. Fear seizes them, as does anger, with all its bodily force. You know, fear does affect your body, right? They are fearless only in the sense that they do not act afraid or fail to act. So they don't act scared, and they don't back off their action because they are scared. Their courage is always equal to the peril sensed or felt. So if there's maximal danger, then it requires maximal courage, so that they can perform what must be done as if they had no fear or pain or death. They have no fear of pain or of death, okay? So here we see that courage is the virtue that you need in the face of something fearful, dangerous. It's something it's almost like an act. You act like you're not scared when you are. Okay, so that's the courage of action. But there's another context in which we need courage, and that's the courage of mind. Okay, now these are samples come from the Greek tragedies. Historically, Adler says there are other sorts of courage. The courage of the tragic hero, of Oedipus and Antigone. And this goes with strength of mind, not body. So the heroes needed their bodies to be strong to fight in battle. These characters need strength of mind. This, perhaps even more than being lion-hearted, is a specifically human strength. Courage does not consist only in conquering fear and in withholding the body from flight no matter what the risk of pain. It consists at least as much in steeling the will, reinforcing its resolutions, and turning the mind relentlessly to seek or face the truth. Okay, so are you willing to seek and face the truth about your origins, who your parents are, and what the prophecies mean? This is Oedipus, right? I don't know if you know the story of Oedipus. So courage of mind, the relentless seeking the truth. And that's something we talk about here, right? Live not by lies, live in the truth. That's going to take courage of mind. Right? There's also civil courage. This is interesting. I'm going to read a longer passage here, but it's so relevant right now. Civil courage Civil courage is as necessary for the citizen as for the ruler. This is a political context now. This virtue, in J.S. Mill's opinion, is especially necessary for citizens of a free government. This is a quote from Mill now. A people may prefer a free government, he writes, but if, from indolence or carelessness or cowardice or want of public spirit, they are unequal to the exertions necessary for preserving it, if they will not fight for it when it is directly attacked, if they can be deluded by the artifices used to cheat them out of it, if by momentary discouragement or temporary panic or a fit of enthusiasm for an individual, they can be induced to lay their liberties at the feet even of a great man, or trust him with powers which enable him to subvert their institutions, in all these cases they are more or less unfit for liberty, and though it may be for their good to have had it even for a short time, they are unlikely long to enjoy it. Now that sounds relevant to what we're going through right now. Are your liberties at stake right now? Are you willing to fight for them? And how? And what kind of courage will that take? All right, so that's civil courage. I think we need that right now. But more importantly, for our purposes, public philosophy, there is the courage of learning. The courage of learning. This is a good one. The work of man is learning as well as action. Man has a duty to the truth as well as to the state. The ability to face without flinching the hard questions reality can put constitutes the temper of a courageous mind. The huge world that girdles us about, William James writes, puts all sorts of questions to us and tests us in all sorts of ways. Some of the tests we meet by actions that are easy, and some of the questions we answer in articulately formulated words. But the deepest question that is ever asked admits of no reply but the dumb turning of the will and tightening of the heartstrings as we say, yes, I will even have it so. So I don't know if I go with what James is saying, but not only in answering questions, but in asking them, courage is needed. So the courage of learning is the courage to ask hard questions and the courage to answer them. Sometimes we have to say difficult things. Sometimes we do know something and we have to speak it, and it's hard and it could be risky, right? So, what do we need courage for in the context of doing public philosophy? We need the virtue of courage in order to seek and know the good. And that's a hard question. That's the courage of learning. Do you know the good? We need courage to do the good. When we know it, we have to act it. And that's the good of action. We have to make choices and act in the world. And we do this all day long. Are we doing it in a courageous way, or are we just going along? Are we going with the flow? Are we doing what's expected of us? Are we acting like a herd? We need courage to live not by lies and to live in the truth. As citizens, we do have a civic duty, and it's to live not by lies. We need courage to know and speak the truth, the whole of our lives. So this is the commitment to the truth. And that's the only way we can bring about justice. And lastly, we need courage to practice a new philosophy in order to build new foundations that can support morality, that can give hope to the Florians of the world. Florian has no hope. He's in despair because he's been handed a culture and a civilization that has no foundation. Just like what Mcintyre is lamenting. There's no foundation for morality. There's no foundation for knowledge. There's no foundation for science. I mean, literally, we have some serious work to do here. So I'm asking you to please join me. Join me by watching these videos, giving me a like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, share with your friends, share on social media, and also have difficult conversations. Courage begets courage. We can enforce each other, reinforce each other, encourage each other. So, don't forget to join me on the Locals channel, kellyburton.locals.com. We are continuing this conversation there. And if you want to know about my book discussions, you can come there as well. And we also have a monthly meeting where we discuss these things. So please join us. Let's get an army of courageous thinkers. All right. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video.